Hello and good afternoon to our new economy shortcut this afternoon, high summer afternoon, and we're very proud and very happy to have Mariana Mazzucato with us to discuss her new book in German, Die große consulting show, and we will talk about it in English. But the opportunity is, well, that this book has just recently been published in German language, and so we can present it to a bigger audience also in Germany. I'm happy that Petra Pinzler from Die Zeit has accepted to moderate and to actively moderate this session as an excellent expert on climate issues, and having followed for many years government politics and ministerial politics in Berlin, so to say that she's very aware of consultancies like McKinsey's and others helping or trying to help the government, and that's exactly the topic of Mariana's book, if this is something that is good or not so good. So I leave it to you both. Petra, thanks for accepting, Mariana being here, and have a good talk and see you later. Petra.
Okay, Thomas, thank you for the kind introduction. You didn't actually introduce Mariana. I think she's quite well known in Germany. She's been all over the place. Professor, author. She has written how many books? I didn't really count them. Mariana.
I mean, of commercial kind of the ones that people can actually buy in bookstores as opposed to pay £300 for an academic book. In other words, the rent-seeking publishing company. 4. So, so the entrepreneurial state, the value of everything, making and taking global economy, mission economy, and then the big con.
The big con is the one we're going to talk about today.
Yes. And I have the English and the German horror story.
Horror picture.
It looks like a horror movie with blood.
So yeah. I think the content might not be bloody, but it's kind of juicy, I'd say. So basically, how did you come up with this subject?
Sure. So maybe, I mean, in fact, mentioning those other books is a good starting point, because what I've been writing about now for 30 years is why we need to go beyond the ideology of big state, small state, state versus business, state versus the market, and that we actually need a capable, strategic public sector working with a capable and strategic, purpose-oriented private sector. Also, of course, civil society organizations like trade unions are incredibly important to our future and past economies. But the real problem is that we have not only under-theorized the state, but that the way we have framed it within economics has also led to its capacity being diminished over time. And so I've written about that in the entrepreneurial state in terms of actually revealing the true story of how some of the biggest innovations in the history of capitalism were actually state finance, but we haven't learned what works, what doesn't, how to do it. In the value of everything, the kind of underlying theory of collective value creation that we need to underpin that. In mission economy, how we need to have outcomes-oriented policies as ambitious as what got us to the moon, but for climate, for the digital divide, for health. And the big con is basically a warning. It's an alarm bell, this new book, saying, actually, all that is impossible unless we actually have internal investments within state structures. And what we've seen over the last 50 years is an ideological diminishing, not of state budgets. Budgets come and go, money comes and goes, but the actual remit of what the state is for has become more and more boring. At best in economics, we talk about fixing market failures or de-risking the cool risk takers or enabling the real players to play the game. And this has led to, as I just mentioned, kind of a hollowing out in some ways of state capacity, which then other actors, and income, the consultants, have been able to benefit from. And this, first of all, is a very important clarification. The book is not against consultants, but the big consulting industry. So the McKinseys, the PwCs, the Deloittes, the KPMGs that people know about. Why? Because this is an industry. It's not just some advisors here and there. Everyone needs advice. Everyone can use a bit of consulting, but an industry which has benefited through its business model on weak state capacity, fearful state fearful of what? Of taking risks, fearful of actually making choices and setting directions and actually then working with the private sector on something. This idea that you're just there to enable or de-risk or fix markets is definitely not a way to get kind of an ambitious collaboration. And what the book does then is both kind of document what's happened over the last 50 years, and I'm happy to go into it in a minute, but also to look at the why. So it's not just like a journalistic book. There was a great book written recently, actually, by two New York Times journalists called When McKinsey Comes to Town. And that's more like of a scoop, like these, really stark stories, including McKinsey's role in the opioid crisis in the US. There's all sorts of big stories also in our own book that kind of we use to reveal the characteristics of a problem. But what we do in the book, which hasn't been done yet, is to talk about the why and kind of look at how it has gone hand in hand with some big dysfunctionalities in modern day capitalism, and also the theory, the economic theory that has also kind of allowed it to take place, because we don't actually have an approach to understanding an ambitious public sector. I forgot to say, I wrote this with a wonderful PhD student, Rosie Collington, and that was really important for me.
She's attending as well, as far as I understood. Rosie, are you there?
I think she's actually in Brazil for a conference that many young people have gone to on the economy. But anyway, yeah.
Let me use the opportunity as I interrupted you. So just add one question. The thing that I liked about the book is that it's not just juicy, it's very well written. It's rather a journalistic book to a certain extent, because you work with examples, you have not just an in-depth research. It's the way it's written is that we can understand through cases where the problem is. Later on, I would like to kind of ask you to go in one or two cases and to show us some examples, explain us in reality what happens somewhere. But let's stick with the overall basic idea of the book. As far as I understood you, it's a logical outcome of the other books that you wrote. In the other books, you kind of demonstrated that the economy between state on the one hand and the economy and the business sector on the other hand is just a wrong way of looking at the world. What you're now doing is that you explain us how a certain industry exploited the way and the fact that the state itself and many politicians regard the state as something, I wouldn't say useless, but unable to face to focus on the real issues. How did this come? I mean, why did the state, why did politics believe itself being so unable to deal with the real problems?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, there's a chapter in Mission Economy, my previous book, where I tell the story of NASA, where there was a person inside NASA who warned about this problem. He was actually the head of procurement, Ernest Brackett. And, if you remember, the moon landing required 400,000 people. It required the public sector and the private sector to be incredibly ambitious. There was many businesses in different sectors, not just aerospace, nutrition, materials, electronics, software. And NASA needed to know how to work with them. It needed to know how to choose which companies to work with, how to work with them, how to write the contracts. So the whole notion of a challenge and mission-oriented contract with a clear goal, and then working on the how, keeping that open. So lots of innovation was inspired from that, but also writing contracts so they were fair and not unfair. So they had no excess profits in the contracts between NASA and the private sector. The guy in charge of all that said, if we continue to outsource our brains to consultants, and remember, McKinsey was actually set up in the 1920s and was already working with NASA in the 1960s, but it wasn't just about McKinsey. It was really about NASA outsourcing its own brain to others. He said, if we continue this, we will get captured by brochuremanship. So at the time, they didn't have fancy McKinsey PowerPoints. They had, nice shiny brochures that private companies, consultants would bring in. And he said, we won't even know who to work with. So the problem was not about NASA working with a consultant or working with the private sector. His point was, if we don't have our own brain, we won't know who to work with or how to work with them or how to write the terms of reference. And fast forward during COVID, the reason that the subtitle, at least in the English version, is how the consulting industry weakens our businesses, infantilizes our governments, and warps our economies. The word infantilizes came about in the book because of a conservative Tory lord in the UK government who saw just how much the UK government was spending on consultants for Brexit and for COVID. So we managed to hire Deloitte to do our test and trace system during COVID-19. They failed miserably, which is not a surprise. They had no expertise in this area. And we can come back to that point about expertise later. And he said, if we continue to do this, we will end up infantilizing Whitehall. And his actual quote was that if we don't allow the civil servants today to work on the crunchiest, most wicked challenges of our time, they will become infantilized. And so then, the question is why? Why would it be that a government during COVID-19, when millions of people are dying, decides to outsource something as important as a test and trace system to Deloitte? Again, the problem in this case is not even so much the outsourcing, it's to Deloitte, which has no experience in test and trace. So, this is really what's also shocking. It's not just why have they stopped investing in their own brains, but why is it that when they're working with others, because COVID, of course, required huge amounts of collective intelligence. None of the problems over time are just for government. They're all for public, private, third sector, and so on. Why was there so little thought put into who would be your best collaborator? In the UK government, for example, we have GDS, Government Digital Services. It's actually a rare example of actually a very capable government agency, which has received not only investment, but was run by really inspirational leaders of the digital area. In fact, two of these people teach on my program at the Institute. Mike Bracken is one of them. But also, for example, in Australia, when they decided to pay 6 million Australian dollars to McKinsey to do the climate strategy, which also failed. It was in all the papers how the modeling was very faulty. The problem is not that McKinsey made a mistake. We can all make mistakes. It's again, why did the Australian government not also use its own capacity within one of its organizations, which is very well known? It's called CSIRO. It's basically an innovation agency on climate and other challenges, to work with them.
And what's the answer to the why? Let me just read out one of the sentences that I found very interesting in your book. The more governments and business outsource, the less they know how to do, causing organizations to become hollow out, stuck in time, and unable to evolve. Is it that the more the state retracts, the less it's able to decide what it can do, what should be outsourced, where it is good at, which organization to choose? What is the development here?
Yes. So that's the effect, right? That's exactly that infantilization point. It's the point we make throughout the book about learning by doing. If you stop doing and you're just kind of at best enabling someone else to do the doing, at worst, just completely outsourcing your own brain so you don't even know how to enable, let alone do, then that learning by doing, the trial and error falls, and that's why you get infantilized. By the way, in the business community, this was a big issue in the management literature. There was all sorts of articles that when business outsources too much and doesn't actually do, it loses what management scholars called absorptive capacity. In other words, businesses won't even understand, their landscape, future technological and market opportunities. The example at the time, I remember I was doing my PhD, was Dell computers, because they ended up just being an assembling machine. They started to do very little research and development compared to some of their competitors. And the management gurus were saying, this is terrible. For now, that might work, just packaging things up. But in 10, 20 years, they will not be a key player because they won't even understand the landscape, right? So really the question is, why don't we think about this for the public sector? But the question of why, because what we just talked about was the net effect, which is you get infantilized. The why is really important. And I go back to my previous point about ideology, right? So, if you think of the whole Thatcherite and Reaganite period, which we could, in a very simplistic way, because we don't have much time today, talk about as kind of this free market ideology, which talked about, yes, the state can do some things, but then get out of the way for value creation. Basically you should just stick to the rules of the game, invest in some basic infrastructure, a bit of education, motorways, hospitals, but then let value be created by, the creative wealth creators, and the state should step out of the way. And both Thatcher and Reagan had wonderful quotes about that, which, have been made fun of in some ways by people because they were just such stark kind of extreme believers in that. Well, then what happened though was that when progressive governments came into power. So in the UK, this would be New Labour with Tony Blair. In the United States, this would be Bill Clinton. And you in Germany, of course, have had your own kind of social democratic version of this. If you then say, no, hold on, Reagan and Thatcher are wrong, we need the state, but you don't actually have a theory of the state as doing anything more than fixing markets, and there's no real sense of public purpose or public value, to big words that I've been working a lot on, then the risk is you just bring in an idea of the state as having also to show that it's as efficient as the private sector. So cost benefit analysis, net present value calculations, or market fixing thinking becomes an open door for consultants who've done this within the private sector to think that they can just kind of almost copy and paste different types of metrics within the public sector.
Let me play the devil's advocate.
Yes.
Why is it wrong that the idea to look at government as something that has to be efficient?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So we definitely need efficiency everywhere. I need efficiency in my family, in my household. Otherwise, nothing would get done. The problem is not efficiency, is how do you measure that? So let me just give you an example. Coming back to the moon landing, the mission was getting to the moon and back, right, in a short amount of time. But what actually happened along the way was that there was lots of different homework problems that had to be solved. And it's that which actually got us economic growth. So we ended up having these amazing dynamic spillovers across the economy, which got us camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula, software. So that already opens our eyes. It means, hold on, whereas for the private sector, you want to be investing in something that also gets sold and makes profit, and you can measure efficiency based on the input and output of that process. In the case of the public sector, what you also want to make sure is that these public investments create the most kind of economy-wide value creation as possible. So, for example, a treasury needs to have some sort of metric, and this is about dynamic efficiency, not static efficiency, that really captures all those dynamic spillovers. So there's lots of questions like that that are really important, which governments should be asking themselves. Or, a study I just did with the BBC was on this, because the BBC is a public broadcaster, which actually has a measure of public value, and they measure it in a way that we try to help them improve in terms of breaking it down into individual value. How good is the program? Do people like it? Social value, things like fighting against fake news or getting women's football, soccer, on screens and getting it as popular as men's soccer, but also industry value. How do you also invest in the frontier areas? In the case of the BBC, the iPlayer, which create a new market for business to get crowded into. So already you see that value creation for government is in some ways much more complex, because it's not just about kind of creating goods and services that the world wants to buy, which doesn't mean it's harder than doing it in the business sector, but we have really good kind of management schools, MBA programs. Think of the Harvard business schools case studies on the private sector. We've never actually done that for the public sector because we didn't think of it as a value creation engine. We just thought of it as an enabler. So part of the reason I set up my institute, which is called the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, is to bring that equal kind of ambition in the public sector, learning what works, what doesn't. So the problem with the big con, so an industry, which actually almost has a conflict of interest, because if government becomes more capable, then the consulting industry, the big industry, not just little consultants, because don't forget, nurses consult, teachers consult, academics consult in areas they've worked on maybe for 30 years. But an industry, as it is currently structured, and we look at the corporate governance and everything, which has no incentive to actually make government more capable, because otherwise they won't get the follow-on contracts, but also has been absolutely filled with conflicts of interest, both in terms of lack of transparency and accountability, but also working on both the advising and the delivery of the thing that they've advised on, like the test and trace example, but also being on both sides of the street. So in South Africa, working both with Eskom, the state-owned enterprise of South Africa for energy, and the Treasury, which is supposed to be regulating Eskom. So this drive to get more and more contracts has also led them to be incredibly unaccountable. So I should say that the important thing in the book is we're not just criticizing the sector. The last chapter looks at what should be done, and I've already alluded to what should be done.
Let's stop here for a second before we come to the answer. What should be done? Let's stick for a second looking into this industry, I was really struck by the mere number that it's $900 billion that this industry is making. It's a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's almost $1 trillion. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When you looked into the different cases and you looked into the different markets and countries, you were making the argument in some countries they are better off than in others. And what I found interesting when I went through the manuscript and typed in Germany doesn't appear that often. Are we better off in Germany than other countries?
No.
Oh, okay.
And the world is large, so I think what we actually should do now on the back of the book is actually make a database of all the different cases and make sure we look at kind of the world, the global south, the global north, different regions, and maybe also at why it is that in some parts of the world things are perhaps not as bad. And one good thing about Germany, I must say, is there's been a recent decision to actually almost have an in-house consultancy.
Right about it.
Yeah, which is interesting because it means also that the costs are capped, so the ability to actually seek massive rents from it are smaller. It's also much more accountable, but also most importantly, it represents an inward investment in some ways within the state structure. And it's sort of a hand's length away from government, but I would argue it's similar to having what some countries have are like gov labs. In Chile, they have a laboratorio de gobierno, which is like a safe place within government to test out kind of, really cool new practices like outcomes-oriented procurement. But I actually think the problem is just very bad everywhere. So the book is not for any one particular region. Of course, that von der Leyen herself, when she was in the German government, admitted that there was big mistakes in contracting because this was a big story back. It came out especially in 2020, just the story of how many lucrative contracts from the defense ministry were given to consultants without proper oversight. There was all sorts of irregularities in the hiring of external consultants by the defense ministry, which also indicated that those consultants actually played a much more significant role than the ministry had publicly claimed. That was a front page story. But there was also Accenture's earnings, from work with the German armed forces that rose from I think it was 500,000 in 2014 to about 20 million in 2018. But again, if they're actually adding value, and if the government, in this case the defense ministry, is becoming more capable over time, so it doesn't need that consulting at the end of the game, then one could argue, so what? And that's the problem, that often there's very little value. It's often just rubber stamping that governments, and we blame governments, by the way, on this, right? That governments aren't almost owning up to the challenges that they face in terms of actually making those difficult decisions, having an open discussion with citizens, or much more transparent, and having certain decisions kind of rubber stamped, if you want, from McKinsey makes it go down the throats a bit easier. But the same thing happens in business. We look at how a lot of problems over the last 50 years in business practice, whether it was the massive downsizing trend, again, Germany, a bit different, but definitely in the UK and the US, or the shareholder value maximization idea, which has led to an excess amount of share buybacks, close to 6 trillion, 12 zeros in the last 10 years by lots of companies. A lot of those decisions, which should actually be really hotly debated in the boardroom, but also between government and business in countries like Germany, where you have, a bit more of a stakeholder capitalism setup, sometimes just by, again, rubber stamping those decisions, as Deloitte or McKinsey told us this was a great idea, has allowed companies to kind of hide behind a screen of, the experts told us this is an important thing. But both within business and in government, what we look is that diminishing of capacity, capability, which we need in a world of climate change, of health pandemics, of digital divide, or just even the sustainable development goals, which need public and private to work together. But if one side is not investing in its brain, it's not a surprise that we end up also with very faulty contracts.
You just mentioned the key word, and before I mention it as well, I would just hint out to our listeners and people out there that if you want to ask a question, just type them in, and I will ask them. I will ask it. The one topic that I found really striking is that you, in the specific area of climate change, you argue that it's not just bad, but it's really bad. It's not just neutral what these organizations do. It's really hindering the efficiency of governments to tackle this problem. Could you explain us how you come to this idea and give us some example?
Sure. And of course, it's not just climate. I mean, and I will discuss the climate thing in a second, but just to finish the German story, in Germany, another huge crisis is being consultified, which is the refugee crisis, right? Which is a huge topic as our boats, in the Mediterranean sink, children, women, all sorts of ages are dying in the Mediterranean. We should really have a capable, strategic, human-centered strategy. Germany paid McKinsey 29.3 million euros to work with the Federal Migration Office that began in 2015 and continues to this day. And a lot of legal experts have said that that shift to limited protection, which has accompanied the introduction of this fast-track asylum center strategy, has also expedited denial for certain classes of migrants, and that's inseparable from the overall drive towards this administrative kind of static efficiency and control of the movement of migrants. Having said that, I must say Germany has been much better than many countries, including my own, Italy, the UK, and so on. So it's never about singling out one country. It's really about looking at the structural kind of attributes. And climate, of course, is such a complex problem, right? It requires technological change, organizational change, behavioral change, tax change. There's almost nothing that goes untouched. Every sector really needs to transform in order to tackle this crisis. And so what's interesting is that, of course, this is an area where, kind of even just long-term emissions reduction plans for countries really need to be thought through, but especially how it needs to be cross-sectoral. It can't just be about renewable energy. By the way, something Germany did that I thought was very good on that is that the loans that were provided to the steel sector in Germany were conditional from the KfW, your public bank, that steel lower its material content of production, which it did through repurpose, reuse, recycle technology. And McKinsey was not involved in that at all. That was actually a government decision to direct its public lending through a public bank in such a way that wasn't just handing out money, loans and so on without conditions, as we do in most parts of the world, but conditional on the sector innovating, investing to transform itself so that it was doing its share for sustainability. That's what we need. And so, that's what we need at the interface of public and private, and both public and private might have some consultants in, not a problem, but that interface between the public and private needs to be very ambitious. And what's interesting, though, is that because it's such a hot topic, because there's incumbents in the fossil fuel sector that don't want to go in that direction, because there's also fear amongst people with jobs that are in fossil fuel kind of, heavy jobs of what might happen to their jobs, their skills, their wages, that fear factor needs to be managed. And we need a just economic transition. We need discussions between trade unions, governments, and businesses all at the table. Also citizen groups, the green movement, which again in Germany has been absolutely important over the last decades. That's what we should be thinking about. How do we bring those different voices to the table? How do we negotiate? How do we make sure that everyone has not only a say, but a real voice at the table to even, direct what I call mission-oriented policies? And so this is where it becomes very dangerous if we see, for example, what happened in Australia, where in 2021, McKinsey was contracted, as I mentioned, to do their emissions reduction program. And not only were they paid $6 million, but also they came out with an incredibly simplistic idea that the transition to net zero by 2050 would actually cost Australia some crazy amount of money, over 275 trillion over the next 30 years. And the problem is that the models that McKinsey used assumed no increase in clean energy use. So they vastly underestimated the growth of solar and wind energy consumption and overestimated the cost of its deployment. Also, secondly, and this is huge, conflicts of interest. I already mentioned them before. So at the same time that they were earning 6 million from the government, they were advising literally at the same time 43 of the 100 biggest polluters in Australia. So, if we could be much more transparent about that, if we could make sure that governments were really investing in their capacity to also understand the modeling, to do the modeling, to interact with the consultants who are helping them with the modeling, then, you know, all of this would be less of a problem, but especially that conflict of interest, if we're sure that the same company, whether it's McKinsey or another consultant, it doesn't matter, is very clear of these conflicts of interest, or they're not allowed to get the contract with the government if they continue to, you know, advise and make lots of money by consulting with the 43 biggest polluters. You know, again, this would all be a different story. So this is why, as I mentioned at the end of the book, we really go into the how to do this differently.
There's one more question I would like to ask, and then I would like to come to some of the questions that are already coming in from the audience. You especially mentioned, or you even quote a former BlackRock employee who is arguing that one of the problems with the consultancy industry is that it uses things like the ESG to kind of water down what governments want from companies in terms of getting better on climate targets. Could you explain that? It sounds rather complicated, but I think it's a key issue.
Yes, and in fact, that's what we mean by saying, there's one chapter where we say that the history of consulting has been the history of capitalism. So the current trend is climate change, the current trend is SDGs and ESGs, but as we know, there's lots of greenwashing behind that. But the interesting issue is that it's not that McKinsey or PwC or Deloitte or, you know, Ernst & Young have created these trends. They didn't create the problem of downsizing or shareholder value maximization or, you know, some of the other trends we look at. They didn't create the ESGs, but these become opportunities for consulting. And so as long as the value that they're bringing to the table, the expertise, right? There's people who've studied corporate governance for 30 years. They really thought about how do we change it? You know, what does stakeholder value really mean? I can think of actually some great management theorists who've thought about this. They're not the ones at the table. At the table is, again, I hate to keep saying McKinsey, let's use another one, EY. EY Consulting's at the table talking about ESG. And the question of whether the way that they're advising these companies is really pushing the companies to go in a direction that is kind of radical, transformational for corporate governance, that is really changing the relationship between the governments and all the different value creators around them, including local, regional, and national governments. And the answer is sort of no, that it just becomes another kind of, you know, thing to create a PowerPoint, copy and paste the usual, you know, 4 square simplistic stories of how to build competence and value within companies. And there's just very little value. I mean, this is why, you know, part of what we're saying is, wouldn't it be great if governments were not just investing within their organizations, but also working alongside those on the outside, not necessarily in the big consulting industry, but, you know, if they have a cancer strategy, of course they should bring in the top oncologists in the world and pay them for a bit of their time to give some advice. We're not pretending that governments should be doing this on their own. If you look at the kind of advice that's come in around ESG and climate, like the one I just mentioned with McKinsey and the climate modeling, it's simply hard to argue that this is state of the art. You know, in Germany, you have the Potsdam Institute. I work very closely with Johann Rockstrom. We co-chair a commission on water as a common good. I would have no problem if, you know, the German government was working very closely with the Potsdam Institute on the climate, because that is literally the hotbed of the most cutting edge thinking. And it's not about me. It's not like I should be choosing who governments work with, but that would be a sign that government even knows who is out there that can best be, they can be working with to get some interesting advice on the side. And that's the other point, that the advice on the side, on the sidelines, is different from advice at the center. Coming back to the infantilization point, the second subtitle, we've seen slowly the consulting industry confusing the advising and the delivery of the services and slowly going to the center. That's the learning by doing problem, doing what government should be doing. In democratically elected societies where you think you're voting for leaders to come up with great plans who then hire ministers and civil servants, or vote in, you know, ministers and civil servants, depending on the structure of a government, to then carry out the difficult tasks with others. You know, that's the problem.
One of the question that's coming in is, could you please speak of the role of the consultants in the emergent European industrial policy initiatives? So there are all kinds of initiatives, CHIPS, Horizon, Digital Europe, EU taxonomy. We don't have to go into them. But how is the consultancy industry? They're also part of the watering down of initiatives, of the watering down of ambitions, or is it to? Do we have to specifically go into the different areas and look what they're doing, or could you generally speak about their roles in this part of the European policy?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We actually don't talk about that enough, but as the book came out, we get emails every single day from ex-consultants or people still in the consulting industry, but especially people working in large organizations, including the United Nations, the OECD, the European Commission, saying, my God, this is huge for us. We ourselves in these large, important multilateral institutions have also stopped investing within capacity. There's lots of different managers in these organizations, but the actual kind of analytic capacity, modeling capacity, digital governance capacity is not there. And then if you look at the same time at just how much money is going into consulting from these same organizations. I have friends, for example, who work a lot in the development area. In fact, a friend of mine was just talking to me about female genital mutilation, which is a huge problem globally. There's organizations that are fundraising to helping stop that. And then you look at how much of that money ends up going to consultants versus on the ground to those that are actually working with those incredibly difficult and dangerous problems. And so it's a leakage in the system. In my book, The Value of Everything, I look at rents and the difference between rents and profits, value creation, value extraction, with the physiocrats back in the 1700s called the sterile class. In other words, that they're rendering the reproductive system of the economy to reproduce itself sterile because the money is not getting reinvested back into production and organizational and technological change, something that Adam Smith even worried about. So that extraction of value out to all these intermediary institutions, as opposed to invested within, not just into the governments, but these organizations like the United Nations, is a huge problem. And others have, kind of documented that. In these kind of single case stories, as I mentioned, we try to look at kind of the overall picture, but that's definitely, something that future PhD students might look at, which is to really break it down in terms of what we've seen happen to multilateral organizations globally. And maybe that's also part of the crisis these same organizations are experiencing. They're not as strategic, intelligent as they could be, perhaps, but that's for others to say.
Yeah, and somehow, to a certain extent, as far as I worked as a correspondent in Brussels, I feel them bound by bureaucracy, by rules that are overwhelming them so much that I rather give they rather let outsiders do the research and the work than doing it's themselves, because they're so they feel so unflexible.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And again, sometimes we roll our eyes, again, as an Italian, believe me, I'm not there to defend the state in any way. Bureaucracy is alive and well. We have lots of red tape, as we do in the UK. But the reason that NASA brought in some really big thinking about the bureaucracy was they realized their own bureaucracy was terrible. Like after the Apollo 1 fire, one of the astronauts who died in the famous Apollo 1 fire, Gus Grissom, he said, on the day of the death of the 3 astronauts who were burnt alive, he said, how the hell are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Because they couldn't hear what was being said in mission control room. On the back of that, because NASA was purpose-oriented, was trying to do such a difficult task with the private sector and others, they brought in someone called George Mueller from Bell Labs, who helped them change the bureaucracy to be, all the different departments in NASA were all of a sudden much more kind of free to be a bit crazy, but delegated teams. But the main thing was that they were always in conversation one with another. In other words, the horizontal communication between these vertical departments was not only increased, but they invested in their understanding of what it meant for agility, flexibility, horizontal communication, the so-called all of government approach. So departments work together on a problem instead of everyone doing their own thing. They had to invest in that capacity because they wanted to get to the moon and back in a short amount of time. So then the question is, could it also be that one of the reasons we've had the problem we're talking about is as governments have reduced their ambitions, where at best they're facilitating, enabling, de-risking, fixing markets, that urgency to do really difficult things with others, never alone, has been reduced so they don't have to reinvent their bureaucracy. You can just kind of stick with your bureaucracy and let people complain, and then you tinker here and there with a bit of regulations. But the need to create an agile, flexible, horizontal, capable, creative bureaucracy that works with others. And, you know, I see one of the questions in the chat was to say something more about PD, which is kind of an in-house consulting in the government. In-house really just meaning that it's 100% publicly owned in Germany. It offers kind of Germany-wide consulting and management services across all different parts of government. The clients are national, federated, state, or municipal authorities and other public bodies. I'm even just reading here from their website. But the most interesting thing is that the organizations that also work with PD from all these different parts of government end up owning a share of this consultant company. So it's almost like a cooperative, and it's much more transparent on the fees. And because it's all publicly kind of available, the knowledge of who they're working with, you also tend to avoid these conflicts of interest, you know, working with ESCOM and the Treasury that's regulating ESCOM in South Africa. Or the recent case that just came out in the news 2 weeks ago was in Australia, where PwC was working with the government on how to price medical devices from kind of a national, you know, capping of prices, with the medical device companies on how to game that pricing system. It's just so clearly, you know, problematic that it's amazing it's even allowed.
One of the other questions that are coming in is, how can we encourage governments to scale down the patronage of the Big Four? Are there governments, and it probably fits quite well to your last response, are there governments that abstain from using the Big Four and rather use others, or not using them at all?
There's definitely, I mean, this is such a big problem globally that it's become a national conversation in almost every country I know. Actually, that's not true. In some countries, it's becoming a national conversation. For example, in Canada, you know, Trudeau had actually committed, because of so many different scandals, but also huge expenses to the taxpayer, to cut it down, but it hasn't been cut down. If you look at the news, there's just some recent evidence that if anything, it's just increasing. Similarly in Australia, similarly here in the UK, even though Lord Agnew, conservative Tory Lord, called it out, it's only been increasing since then, since 2020 when he said this. So I think the fact it's a national and international conversation, again, I've been speaking a lot to developing countries. I was just in South Africa, where the book launch just created a huge discussion, very heated discussion, because of how bad it's gotten in South Africa. I think this is the moment to step back and say, how do we turn this, almost workshop it? Why don't we really understand what's happening inside those government agencies, why they're making these decisions? Because, you know, civil servants aren't stupid. Why is this happening? Why does it continue to happen? Where are the pressures? And what can be done concretely to combat it? And I do think the main thing that has to be done is to invest within the public service to, you know, from all the really difficult things, including the digital governance of the challenges, the infodemic side of COVID was one of the most important sides. How did we process the information? Again, that test and trace side of things.
Maybe this is just the dirty truth that lies behind the problem, that if the government wanted to change this, is at first it has to accept that it maybe needs more public sector employees. They need to be better qualified, and it has to tackle the whole, as you already mentioned, the whole system government works. And this apparently seems to, you have to reform bureaucracy, and this apparently seems so difficult that it's just much more easy to hand out a contract to the McKinseys.
Yeah. We also need our young and brightest students to go into the civil service and stop.
One of the questions was, well, how can we crush this image that the good, interesting jobs are out there inside the Big Four and not inside the government? So we have to change this perception as well.
Yeah, and again, many of the people we spoke to for the interviews behind the book, but also after the book was published, in terms of people coming to us, was by young people who said that they actually went into the consulting industry not only because it's better paid, you know, than the civil service, but also because they really thought this was the hotbed of the most interesting thinking around the things they care about, like climate, precisely because of all the, you know, surfing on top of these climate and ESG topics from this sector. And then they were disillusioned on what they actually found inside. And so there is a bit of that disillusionment sense, but what we really should be asking is how do we construct jobs in the civil service to be as, attractive, definitely well paid. That's a problem in some countries, not all. In Singapore, they pay their civil servants sometimes $1 million, to direct these agencies, but that's unrealistic for most countries. What attracts top people into government is also the remit of government. I often give the example of when Steve Chu, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, agreed to be the head of the Department of Energy for Obama. And that wasn't because Obama said, oh, come in and de-risk Elon Musk. It was come in and help us steer an 800 billion stimulus program to be green, because that's what happened in Europe. We did austerity, very foolish after the financial crisis. In the United States, they had a proper fiscal stimulus program that was green directed, at least initially. So Steve Chu came in, he thought it was an honor. He set up ARPA-E, which is like DARPA, very famous government agency that got us the internet. He did it for energy, ARPA-E, brought in Arun Majumdar, who's a top scientist, to run ARPA-E. They gave out all sorts of, loans to particular types of companies, guaranteed loans that they thought were going to be the wave of green investments in the US. One of these was Tesla. Tesla went very well. And of course, Elon Musk got all the credit. Another one was Solyndra. It went bad and everyone blamed government. So this is the other thing. The narrative of what government is for shouldn't just be about mission-oriented stuff, as I write about, but also the structure of the tools should be ambitious. So in that case, the portfolio should have been exactly the opposite of what the government did, because what the US government did was to say to Tesla, if you don't pay back the loan, we want 3 million shares in your company, which makes no sense. Why would you want 3 million shares in a shitty company that doesn't pay back the loan? The company did pay back the loan. The price per share went from 9 to 90. That difference multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss. Solyndra was a solar company that went bankrupt, and the next round of investment. So that means we need things like public venture capital kinds of thinking. By the way, that's what Israel did with Yozma. It's why they have the Startup Nation. But it means that the tools, the loan programs, the grants, the procurement contracts need to be challenge outcomes oriented. I can tell you it's much more interesting to work in government if that's what you think you're doing, than come in because you might be able to de-risk Elon Musk, or come in and do a carbon tax. As important as carbon taxes are, it's still on the side. It's not at the center of value creation.
It's a fascinating conversation that we are having. Thomas, you're probably listening. Is there something that I did not ask? Is there something that comes up to your mind listening to us?
I was just wondering, because we have a lot of questions in the chat. I was just
some of them I can't see, so probably you can raise them.
Yeah, I was just don't know. You talked about it a little bit, but it was the question about the relevance of the problem. Depending on regions and geographies. So there was someone apparently from Japan and others from asking more generally, is this a very particular problem for the Western countries or going beyond? I mean, you partly answered the question, but maybe you will want to say some words.
I don't know much about China, for example. That'd be interesting to ask Isabella Weber, of course, who's written a whole book on China and where it's getting its economic advice from in terms of economic theory. It's a great book, by the way. She got her PhD at actually her master's at the New School for Social Research. I think her PhD was from Cambridge. Anyway, so I don't know much about the Chinese situation, but definitely, in Africa, it's a huge problem. In Latin America, it's a massive problem. In Europe, in the US. So in terms of the Western world, where we also have democracies which have not invested within the democratic process, because of course the most important thing there is making sure that you are voting for those who will ultimately govern, as opposed to then outsource the governing to someone else because you're not voting for that someone else. That's really the problem we highlight the most. We don't look at Russia, even though there's been a lot of consulting, especially as the Soviet Union got marketized. We had lots of consulting, of course, there as well, precisely in how to transform Russia into a market, system. And one could actually look at that advice, how it was received, and the very problematic copy and pasting as linked to where we are today with that part of the world. We mention it a bit in the book, but we don't do kind of a proper case study on it. But I think there was also a question I saw, where was it? The one about Chile, because we do look at, we actually have that example of Salvador Allende's Chile at the beginning of the book. And the question says that is there a contradiction?
Not just a contradiction to just have started in that with this example instead of highly capitalist.
But actually we begin also, I mean, like one of the biggest examples that we begin with is the NHS in the UK, where when the NHS was actually set up, it received advice from others. I mean, because again, remember that the main point that we're trying to make is not that we shouldn't have consultants or consulting, that we shouldn't have advisors, that somehow government should do everything on its own. We look at functional versus dysfunctional consulting. So again, the emergence of a sector, an industry whose underlying business model is full of these conflicts of interest, but also has no incentive to actually make that system more capable, because then you don't get the follow-on contract. Or when often the presence, we say in every room, is of consultants who often just are working for free, right? They look like they're just, I mean, I experienced this when I was helping the Italian government in COVID. I was working for free, like many academics were. And I asked, why are there all these consultants in the room? It was literally 17 of us in a commission for COVID-19. It was Giuseppe Conte's commission. He was prime minister at the time. We had Vittorio Colau, who set up the Colau Commission and asked me and some others to join. And there were 17 of us and 13 people from McKinsey. And I said, sorry, what's happened here? Who are they? And the answer was, oh, Mariana, come on, you know how inefficient the Italian civil service is. They're just taking minutes. They're just going to make the whole system more efficient. So one is like, okay, I mean, civil servants can take minutes. Is that really a problem? But fine, take the minutes. All the PowerPoints that we ended up getting were, you know, nice and sexy, made by these 30-year-olds. But you can imagine that once Italy got its share of the, EU Next Gen, 2 trillion program, the equivalent of the US's, big stimulus package, McKinsey has in fact been at the table at almost every single contract. Draghi famously, when he came in later as the prime minister, outsourced almost a whole Italian recovery program from the Treasury to McKinsey. And so being in the room for free, what we call lowballing, to get the information, to look like you're there to just kind of help make the system more efficient, is part of that problem, which is fine to be in the room, but then it should be very transparent. What kind of information is being shared? What kind of information do you have? Does that help you get those follow-on contracts, which of course are in the millions? You're no longer working for free to help the poor civil service take minutes, right? That whole kind of edifice really needs to be made, again, much more transparent. And of course, we should be investing in the ability of civil servants, not only to take minutes and do PowerPoints, but to really, again, work with these incredibly difficult problems. And if we don't have those investments into things like, the digital governance of our civil service, of course, it's going to be impossible to manage 21st century problems.
One of the questions going directly to this point, that this happens also at UN, the COPs, at all kinds of international organizations, that you first get a pro bono advice from the big consultancy industry firms, and then afterwards they got the big contracts. So is there any way to safeguard that besides being transparent?
Yes, well, that's actually interesting, because the Munich Security Conference also was famously run. Was it Boston Consulting Group that got the contract for that too, right? So these are really big global conferences that are meant to be bringing the leaders to the table, thinking about, big problems, whether it's war or the Sustainable Development Goals. And the fact that they are being not only sponsored often by the consultants, but consulted by the consultants, means that the way the conversation is also being played out, the way it has to remain safe, not making too much discomfort in the room. By the way, a funny thing that happened after the book came out is I was called by Aspen Ideas, where I was supposed to present the book this June, and they said, would you mind maybe presenting your previous book instead? I said, why?
No, you're kidding.
No, I mean, it was quite shocking. And I was like, why? And they said, well, Deloitte, our main sponsor, finds it a bit uncomfortable, a bit awkward. I was like,
one of the question actually is, has there been any reaction by the big four? So this is the answer to it.
This is the only one that was open. And, luckily it's in an email. So But, again, this is not meant to put anyone in a difficult position on my part. I actually think that the industry would be incredibly smart to interact with this issue because everyone's talking about it. We just simply tried to produce a much more kind of academic analysis of it. But the actual, all the cases that we bring up, we didn't do the scoop. We didn't go out there and discover them. These are all documented in global newspapers, including the Financial Times last week. So a confident consulting company that wants to show that it produces value would also admit, hey, we've made some mistakes. And let's do this better. And it's not about just talking to us. There's others, I'm sure, who have great ideas. But in terms of us, I would have expected, especially the big ones who have, the leverage, the money to waste a bit on this topic, to be wanting to talk to us more. Instead, we ended up with, I can tell you, really interesting consulting companies that are very well known, very good in terms of also who they hire. Like they hire by good, I mean, they're hiring some of that top talent from the Ivy Leagues and so on, like the Big Four, but they see themselves as actually kind of much more focused on topics. So Systemic by Oppenheim, we had Volans by John Elkington, we had Arup, the very large Arup, I don't know how to pronounce it, ARUP, the very large kind of construction and architecture consulting, who all came to us, tried to do book talks with us, bought the book for all their staff. Arup did that, as did Volans, because they said, this is the moment for us to change. And they, of course, weren't even the main ones that we were, talking about. And yet, of course, those problems are also there for them. And they saw it as an opportunity for a discussion. You can imagine that, for universities, if they were under fire, you would expect universities to look within to understand how they can change the way that universities are structured. And, there's big discussions globally about universities. So a confident, well-meaning actor tends to take critique as an opportunity for self-reflection. And if that doesn't happen, you sometimes have to wonder, why?
So let's see how the reaction towards your book will be in Germany. Whether it'll also be the big silence, or whether we'll have some kind of interesting debates. Thomas, did I forget anything? Did I not mention anything?
I think we could certainly discuss a lot more of all the issues, but this was, I think, a very exciting and very helpful and to the point discussion, and your questions were excellent. Because Mariana, you said at the beginning that this cover, and I'll show it again for you, is about like a little bloody one. And I was wondering, where does this come from? And I will show you where it comes from.
Yeah, exactly. It looks like the Rocky Horror Show. That
was probably the historical reference to it. I don't want to go into detail on that, but
we didn't
so
like
if
it.
you look and want to buy the book, don't pick the right one.
But we actually pushed back on the cover, and I think it's great that covers are different, so we didn't mind. In the end, we said absolutely fine, publish it, like this. But the reason we didn't like it is because it looks like that it's all against the consultants, like they're terrible, they're bloody, they're the devil, they're evil. It's not the message in the book. It really is about how have we ended up with a system that is so problematic, that is not incentivized, that governments are not making those courageous strategic decisions to invest within their capacity. It will even save them money in the future, right? Because you'll be better at what you're doing by actually not having to pay all these other intermediaries. But especially, again, working with others in strategic ways, big problem, but also businesses, we blame them for not owning up to their decisions. It's very convenient to have a decision rubber stamped, as Deloitte told us to do this, so that no one bothers you. So we put just as much, I don't want to say blame, but attention on all the different actors in the system and why they must change. And this makes it look like we're just saying the bloody consultants, it's all their fault, which would be a very easy scapegoat and would basically produce no change.
But just to defend the subtitle says that it's the Beratungsbranche is like the consultancy industry. So it's in the way correct as you.
Yeah, but it's the ecosystem. So we really look at the whole ecosystem, right? Like what needs to change in government, what needs to change in business, what needs to change in the contracts between the consultants and these actors. Even the, I mean, this is funny talking about the title, my publishers won't be happy, but even the English title, How the Consulting Industry Weakens Our Business, Infantilizes Our Governments, and Warps Our Economies, we said, it just became too much of a mouthful. We said, be careful. We're not actually saying it's the consulting industry that weakens business or infantilizes government. It's the relationship between the consulting industry and governments. And a lot of that is the relationship that government has accepted to be in, just like, you know, in a couple, a marriage, it's not ever one's own fault, right? There's always a problematic ecosystem, right? In this case. And I've often, in my other work, I often say we should have better metrics for distinguishing a mutualistic, symbiotic ecosystem from a parasitic ecosystem, a predator-prey ecosystem. And a biologist has the ability to do that. They do that using biological, you know, mathematics, biological analysis. In economics, we've bought into, you know, Newtonian physics as the only mathematics that we know how to work with, you know, unique equilibria, the average matters, and even the mathematics that we use. This is sort of a separate topic, but it's not necessarily the kind of math or the analogies that we need to look at ecosystems and how we work together in better ways. And my new book that I'm starting to write on the common good is all about that, how we need collective intelligence embedded in everything we do, and, you know, common good criteria and how we work together. And if not, we're not going to get out of the mess we're in.
Mariana, before talking about your next book, I would suggest that the people read this one. It's really not scandalizing the issue, I'd say. It's rather really in-depth and good analysis. I loved reading it.
Thank
Thomas, you did as well. I think it was a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone that organized this and the participants, and to you, Petra, for great questions.
Thank you, Petra, and thank you, Mariana. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Bye.